A millionaire betrayed his beloved with a young woman just to see her suffer. 8 years later, he froze when he saw her in a restaurant with his rival and a little boy. Jonathan Walker stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the San Diego skyline glitter against the twilight. In his hand, a small velvet box held a 3-carat diamond ring that had cost more than most people's homes. After 5 years with Grace, he was finally ready to take the leap. "Mr. Walker, your father is here," his assistant announced over the intercom. Jonathan's shoulders tensed. He hadn't told his father about his plans to propose, and now Charles Walker's unexpected appearance threatened to cast a shadow over what should have been a perfect moment. "Send him in," Jonathan replied. Slipping the ring box into his suit pocket, Charles Walker entered with the commanding presence of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. At 68, his hair had gone silver, but his eyes retained the sharp, calculating gaze that had intimidated business rivals for decades. "Taking off early?" Charles asked, noting the champagne chilling on Jonathan's desk. "Must be something special." "I'm having dinner with Grace," Jonathan said, keeping his tone neutral. Charles's expression darkened slightly. 5 years with that school teacher, quite the endurance test. "Dad, don't start." "I'm just saying, son, a man in your position. Women come with agendas." Jonathan turned to face his father. "Grace isn't like that. She was with me before the Thompson Heights project doubled our portfolio." "Was she?" Charles challenged, pouring himself a whiskey without asking. "Or was she playing the long game?" Images flashed through Jonathan's mind. His 8th birthday, standing alone in a freshly pressed suit, waiting for his mother to arrive. The call that never came. His father's bitter words. "She found someone with deeper pockets, son. That's what women do." "Grace isn't Mom," Jonathan said firmly. Charles took a slow sip of his drink. "Your mother taught me a valuable lesson. Trust must be earned, not given freely. I trust Grace." "Then you're already making my mistake." Charles set down his glass with deliberate precision. "You know what they say about a son repeating his father's failures." The words hit their mark. Jonathan had spent his life trying to be different from Charles. Less cold, less cynical. Yet the fear of being abandoned again lived in him like a dormant virus, waiting for the right trigger to erupt. "What are you suggesting?" Jonathan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Test her," Charles said simply. "If she's the real thing, she'll pass. If not," he shrugged. "Better to know now than 5 years from now when she takes half your empire." "That's ridiculous," Jonathan said, but the seed was already planted, taking root in fertile soil of his deepest insecurities. That night at dinner, Grace Thompson wore a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her eyes. She taught 3rd grade at a school in one of San Diego's struggling neighborhoods, and as she spoke about her students, her face lit up with genuine passion. "Mrs. Ramirez cried when I told her Miguel had jumped 2 reading levels," she said, reaching across the table to touch Jonathan's hand. "Sometimes I think I have the best job in the world." "You could teach anywhere," Jonathan said. "Private schools would pay triple what you're making now." Grace smiled. "It's not about the money. Those kids need someone who believes in them." The ring box felt heavy in Jonathan's pocket. He'd planned to propose tonight, but his father's words echoed in his mind. "Trust must be earned." "Everything okay?" Grace asked, noticing his distraction. "You seem somewhere else tonight." "Just work," he lied, squeezing her hand. "The Carson project is having some issues." Later that night, as Grace slept beside him, Jonathan stared at the ceiling. What if his father was right? What if one day Grace simply disappeared, like his mother had? The thought alone made his chest tighten with panic. The next morning, Charles arrived at Jonathan's office with a file folder. "What's this?" Jonathan asked. "Insurance," Charles replied, sliding the folder across the desk. Inside was a detailed plan to test Grace's loyalty, including photos of Amber Collins, a 23-year-old model who had worked on previous Walker development campaigns. "This is insane," Jonathan said, closing the folder. "Is it?" Charles asked. "If Grace truly loves you, she'll fight for you. If she's just after the Walker fortune..." He left the sentence hanging. "I'm not doing this," Jonathan insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. 1 week later, Jonathan found himself at a charity gala with Amber Collins on his arm instead of Grace. He'd told Grace he had a business dinner. Another lie in what had become a growing collection. "She'll hear about this," Amber said, smiling for the photographers. That's the point, right? The plan was as cruel as it was simple. Create doubt, make Grace think Jonathan was losing interest, then reveal the affair at her 30th birthday party. If she fought for him, she passed the test. If she walked away, Charles would be proven right. Just stick to the script, Jonathan said, ignoring the guilt gnawing at him. For the next 2 months, Jonathan lived a double life. With Grace, he was increasingly distant, canceling plans and working late. In public, he was seen with Amber at restaurants and events where gossip would spread quickly. Grace noticed the change. "Is everything okay between us?" she asked one night, her voice careful, measured. "You've been so distant lately." "Just stressed," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "This new project is taking all my energy." "We'll get through it," she said, kissing his cheek with such trust that Jonathan almost confessed everything. Instead, he pulled away, telling himself it would all be worth it when she proved his father wrong. What Jonathan didn't know was that Grace had her own secret. 2 days earlier, she'd sat in a sterile doctor's office, listening to terms like aggressive tumor and treatment options. The headaches she'd been having weren't stress or migraines. The doctor had recommended telling loved ones, building a support system. Grace had planned to tell Jonathan after her birthday celebration. The night of Grace's 30th birthday party arrived. The final act in Charles's cruel play, the restaurant was filled with friends and colleagues, all unaware they were about to witness the deliberate destruction of a relationship. Jonathan watched Grace greeting guests, radiant in a silver dress. Despite looking thinner than usual, for a moment his resolve wavered. Then he saw his father watching from across the room, and something hardened inside him. "It's showtime," Amber whispered, taking his arm as they approached Grace. As Grace turned to greet them, Jonathan pulled Amber into a passionate kiss, putting on a show for everyone, especially Grace. The room fell silent. When Jonathan finally looked at Grace, he expected tears, anger, demands for an explanation. Instead, he saw something worse: dignity. Her face had gone pale, but her expression remained composed. She looked at him not with rage, but with a profound sadness that cut deeper than any angry outburst could have. "If she loves you, she'll fight," his father had said. Grace didn't fight. She simply said, "May God bless your new life," turned, and walked away, leaving Jonathan standing there with the sickening realization that he might have made the greatest mistake of his life. And as she disappeared through the doorway, Jonathan had no idea that Grace was carrying 2 devastating secrets: her cancer diagnosis, and the news that her sister Olivia had died, leaving behind a 3-month-old baby boy who now had no one but her. The first signs of Grace's illness had appeared 3 months before her birthday. Headaches that started as minor inconveniences gradually intensified until even the softest light made her wince with pain. She dismissed them as stress, popping ibuprofen between classes and keeping her smile firmly in place for her 3rd graders. "Ms. Thompson, are you okay?" little Sophia had asked one afternoon, when Grace paused mid-sentence, momentarily disoriented. "Just thinking about our field trip next week," Grace had replied, quickly regaining her composure. But the episode frightened her enough to finally make the doctor's appointment she'd been postponing. She never expected the MRI results to change her life forever. "I'm afraid it's a tumor," Dr. Ryan Clark had said, his kind eyes grave as he showed her the scan. "Based on its location and size, we need to act quickly." Grace had sat there, numb, as he outlined treatment options, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, words that belonged to other people's lives, not hers, not at 30. "Should I bring someone with me next time?" Dr. Clark had asked. "Your husband?" "Perhaps. My boyfriend," Grace had corrected, thinking of Jonathan. "And yes, I just need some time to tell him." She'd planned to tell Jonathan after her birthday, a celebration of life before facing its potential end. But now, as she walked away from the restaurant, his betrayal burning like acid in her veins, she realized she would be facing the battle alone. Grace barely remembered the taxi ride home. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Friends at the party, no doubt, calling to check on her. She switched it off. In her apartment, she moved like a sleepwalker, methodically packing an overnight bag. She couldn't stay in San Diego. Not with Jonathan's face plastered across business magazines and society pages. Not with the pitying glances she'd received from friends who witnessed her humiliation. And especially not now. With her sister gone and baby Lucas depending on her. The call about Olivia had come just hours before her birthday party. A rainy road. A truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel. In an instant, her vivacious younger sister was gone, leaving behind a 3-month-old boy with no father in the picture. "You're his only family now," the social worker had said. Grace had promised to drive to Los Angeles in the morning to collect Lucas and make arrangements for Olivia. That was before Jonathan had destroyed whatever future they might have had together. Now, as dawn broke over San Diego, Grace made a decision. She would disappear completely, start fresh somewhere no one knew her, where she could focus on getting well and raising Lucas without the shadow of Jonathan's betrayal hanging over them. Meanwhile, across town, Jonathan woke in his penthouse, Amber sleeping beside him. The charade had continued after Grace left the restaurant, a bottle of champagne, deliberate laughter too loud, a performance for anyone still watching. He'd felt hollow inside, mechanical, as he escorted Amber home and accepted her invitation upstairs. "She didn't fight for you," Amber murmured now, stirring beside him. "Guess your father was right." Jonathan said nothing, remembering Grace's face, that devastating dignity. Not a single tear, no pleading, no demands for explanation, just that soft blessing before walking away. It wasn't the reaction he had expected, and something about it left him deeply unsettled. His phone rang. "Charles, did our little plan work?" his father asked without preamble. "She left," Jonathan said flatly. "Then I was right," Charles replied, satisfaction evident in his voice. "If she truly loved you, she would have fought tooth and nail. Instead, she walked away from a Walker fortune without a backward glance. Suspicious, don't you think?" Jonathan frowned. "Or maybe she has too much pride to beg. Pride doesn't pay bills, son. Trust me, she'll be back once the reality of life without your financial support sets in." But Grace didn't come back. Days passed, then weeks. Jonathan continued the charade with Amber, telling himself it was to save face. He tried calling Grace once when Amber was in the shower, but her number had been disconnected. Her apartment was vacant, her position at the school filled by a substitute. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. "She ran away," Charles said when Jonathan mentioned her disappearance. "Guilty people run, Jonathan. Remember that. 300 miles away, in a small apartment in Sacramento, Grace sat in another doctor's office, Lucas sleeping peacefully in his carrier beside her. The tumor is aggressive, the new oncologist said, reviewing the records Dr. Clark had forwarded. But you're young and otherwise healthy. We have good reason to be optimistic. Grace nodded, automatically reaching to stroke Lucas's downy head. What are my chances? The doctor hesitated. With the combined treatment plan, surgery followed by radiation and chemotherapy, we're looking at about a 60% 5-year survival rate. Those aren't bad odds, Mrs. Thompson. 40% chance of dying before Lucas was even in kindergarten. Grace swallowed hard. When do we start? We should schedule the surgery as soon as possible. Grace looked down at her sleeping nephew. She had no family left to help. Her savings would only last a few months, and she was facing a battle for her life while caring for a baby who had already lost everything. For a brief, weak moment, she considered calling Jonathan, despite everything. He would help if he knew, but pride kept her hand from reaching for the phone. Pride, and the memory of his lips on that woman's. The calculated cruelty of doing it at her birthday celebration, in front of everyone they knew. No, Jonathan Walker had made his choice. She would make hers. Back in San Diego, Jonathan threw himself into work, expanding the Walker empire to unprecedented heights. His relationship with Amber continued for appearance's sake. Though there was little warmth between them, she played her part well, accompanying him to events, smiling for cameras, accepting the expensive gifts that seemed to be the only language he knew for expressing. What? Not love. Perhaps obligation. You should make it official, Charles suggested 6 months after Grace's disappearance. Marry the girl, she's from a good family, looks great in photos, and understands how our world works. I don't love her, Jonathan said bluntly. Charles laughed. Love is for fairy tales and poor people, son. Men like us marry strategically. The irony wasn't lost on Jonathan. He had destroyed his relationship with Grace to prove she wasn't a gold digger, only to find himself contemplating a marriage that was essentially a business arrangement. Yet 3 months later, he found himself proposing to Amber with a ring, twice the size of the one he'd chosen for Grace. The proposal made the society pages. Of course, Jonathan Walker, heir to the Walker development fortune, engaged to model Amber Collins. A perfect match, the columnists gushed. The night of their engagement party, Jonathan excused himself early, claiming a headache. He drove aimlessly through the city until he found himself parked outside Grace's old apartment building. New curtains hung in the windows that had once been hers. New lives continuing while he remained stuck, haunted by the question that grew louder with each passing day. What if he had been wrong? "You're doing great, Grace. Stay with me just a little longer." Dr. Ryan Clark's voice seemed to come from far away. Grace focused on it, a lifeline through the fog of pain and medication. The surgery to remove her brain tumor had lasted 7 hours. Now, 3 days later, she was finally lucid enough to understand what he was saying. "The surgery was successful. We got most of the tumor," Dr. Clark explained, checking her vitals. "But we'll need to follow up with radiation and chemotherapy to make sure we get all of it." Grace tried to nod, wincing at the movement. "Lucas," she whispered. "Your neighbor has him. Mrs. Chen. Right. She's been bringing him to the hospital every day for you to see, even though you probably don't remember." Grace closed her eyes, grateful. She'd known Mrs. Chen for only 3 weeks before the surgery, yet the elderly woman had stepped up without hesitation when Grace explained her situation. "I raised 5 children," Mrs. Chen had said simply. "One baby is no trouble. You focus on getting well. When can I go home?" Grace asked Dr. Clark now. "Maybe tomorrow, if your numbers look good." He hesitated. "Do you have someone who can stay with you? The first few weeks of recovery are crucial." Grace thought briefly of Jonathan. In her weakest moments, usually at 3 a.m. when pain kept her awake, she imagined telling him everything. In those fantasies, he was devastated by what she was going through, begging forgiveness for his betrayal, promising to take care of her and Lucas. But reality always intruded. Jonathan had made his choice. He was probably engaged to that model by now, planning the society wedding of the year. "Mrs. Chen will help," Grace said, pushing thoughts of Jonathan away. "And I've hired a part-time nursing student to watch Lucas during my treatments." Dr. Clark frowned. "That sounds expensive." "I have savings," Grace lied. In truth, her savings were rapidly depleting. Between medical bills, rent, baby supplies, and the nursing student, she had perhaps 3 months before financial disaster struck. "Well, don't worry about the medical bills just yet," Dr. Clark said, as if reading her mind. "I've enrolled you in a clinical trial for your type of tumor. The hospital will cover most of the treatment costs." Grace stared at him, suspicious of this unexpected kindness. "Why would you do that?" Dr. Clark shrugged. "Your case is interesting from a medical perspective. I'm not a lab rat, Dr. Clark." "Ryan," he corrected. "And no, you're not. You're a young mother fighting a battle no one should have to face alone. I'm in a position to help. It's that simple." Grace didn't correct his assumption that she was Lucas's mother. It was easier this way. And in her heart, she had already embraced the role completely. What Grace didn't know was that Dr. Ryan Clark had recognized her name immediately, his family's company. Clark Enterprises had been locked in a bitter rivalry with Walker Developments for years, when Grace Thompson, known in San Diego social circles as Jonathan Walker's longtime girlfriend, suddenly appeared in Sacramento with a brain tumor and an infant. Ryan's curiosity was piqued. A quick internet search had revealed the ugly public breakup at her birthday party. Ryan had felt an immediate sympathy for this woman, abandoned by a Walker when she needed support most. He didn't mention the connection, respecting her obvious desire for a fresh start. Meanwhile, in San Diego, Jonathan's engagement to Amber quickly soured. The woman who had played the seductress so convincingly revealed her true colors once the ring was on her finger. Her spending became extravagant, her demands endless, her interest in Jonathan's work or thoughts non-existent. "You're paying for the Walker name," Charles reminded him when Jonathan complained. "Pretty arm candy comes at a premium." The wedding plans grew more elaborate by the day. 800 guests, a reception at the Fairmont, a dress from Paris. Jonathan watched the circus unfold with detached indifference, throwing money at it to keep Amber satisfied and off his back. He buried himself in work, launching the most ambitious project of his career, Walker Heights, a luxury residential and commercial complex that would transform an entire district of San Diego. The project consumed him. 14-hour days that left no time to think about Grace, or the hollow feeling that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. "You look like hell," his project manager, Dave, commented one evening as they reviewed blueprints. "Thanks," Jonathan replied dryly. "Seriously, man, when's the last time you slept? Or ate something that didn't come from a vending machine?" Jonathan rubbed his eyes. "I'm fine. This about your wedding? Cold feet?" "No," Jonathan said too quickly. "Just focused on the project." Dave studied him for a moment. "You know, I ran into Grace's friend Kelly last week." Jonathan's head snapped up. "What did she say? Has she heard from Grace?" The eagerness in his voice was embarrassing. Dave raised an eyebrow. "Nothing specific. Just that Grace had to leave town suddenly for a family emergency. Some relative died, left a kid behind." Jonathan frowned. Grace didn't have much family, just a younger sister. "I think, well, whoever it was, Kelly said Grace has legal custody of the kid now." The information hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Grace was raising a child somewhere, a child that wasn't his. She had started a new life, one that didn't include him, while he was trapped in an engagement to a woman he couldn't stand. That night, Jonathan called off the engagement, ignoring Amber's hysterical threats to sue for breach of promise and emotional distress. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, hurling a crystal vase at his head. "Do you know how humiliating this will be?" "I'll give you a generous settlement," Jonathan said flatly. "But this farce is over." Later, he sat in his darkened penthouse, a glass of scotch in hand, thinking about Grace raising a child alone. Was it her sister's baby? Had Olivia died? The thought of Grace dealing with such grief while he'd been playing house with Amber made him sick with shame. Charles was predictably furious about the broken engagement. "You're a fool," he raged when Jonathan told him. "That Thompson girl has bewitched you even in her absence. She's not coming back, son. Accept it and move on." "I have moved on," Jonathan lied. "The engagement to Amber was a mistake from the start. I'm focusing on Walker Heights now." Charles studied him with narrowed eyes. "See that you do. I've put too much into building this company to watch you throw it away over some school teacher." Walker Heights became Jonathan's obsession, his redemption, his penance. He drove his team relentlessly, demanding perfection at every turn. The project would set new standards for luxury and sustainability, proving to everyone, to himself, that he was more than Charles Walker's son, more than the man who had cruelly tested and lost the only woman he'd ever loved. 2 years after Grace's disappearance, Jonathan stood at the grand opening of Walker Heights, champagne in hand, cameras flashing. The project had won awards for its innovative design and environmental features. Walker Development's stock had doubled. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt nothing. "Smile, darling," purred his date for the evening, a socialite whose name he could barely remember. "Everyone's watching." Jonathan pasted on the expected expression, playing his part flawlessly. Inside, he was as empty as the model apartments around him, beautifully furnished spaces devoid of actual life. That same evening, in Sacramento, Grace sat on a park bench watching Lucas toddle after pigeons. Her hair had grown back after the chemotherapy, curling softly around her face. The latest scan showed no signs of the tumor returning. Dr. Clark, Ryan, had cautiously used the word remission for the first time. "Mama, look," Lucas called, his chubby legs working hard as he chased the birds. "I see you, brave boy," Grace called back, her heart full. She had no idea that at that exact moment, 300 miles away, Jonathan was raising a glass to his hollow success, his eyes scanning the crowd as if still searching for the one face he would never find there. 6 years passed like the slow turn of seasons, inevitable, relentless, transforming everything in their path. Grace stood at the window of her classroom in the Westlake Academy, watching her students file out to waiting cars and buses. The private school, with its manicured grounds and state-of-the-art facilities, was a far cry from the underfunded public school where she'd once taught in San Diego. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once refused Jonathan's suggestion to teach at such a place, claiming her heart belonged with the children who needed her most. Life had a way of rewriting one's principles. "Ms. Thompson." A small voice broke into her thoughts. Grace turned to find Lily Chen, a quiet second grader with serious eyes. "Yes, Lily. I finished my book. Can I have another one?" Grace smiled. "Of course, let's find you something challenging," as she helped Lily select a new book. Grace caught her reflection in the classroom window. At 36, the softness of youth had given way to more defined features. Her hair, once long and chestnut, now fell in a stylish bob that framed her face. Regular tennis games and yoga had replaced the frantic running after toddler exercise of Lucas's early years. Most importantly, the scar from her brain surgery had faded to a thin silver line hidden beneath her hair. A battle wound from a war she had won. The latest scan, her annual checkup with Ryan, had shown no signs of recurrence. 6 years cancer-free. "Ms. Thompson is pretty," Grace heard Lily whisper to another student as they left. Pretty, not a word Grace would have chosen. Survivors had a different relationship with their appearance. Every gray hair was a victory, every laugh line, a gift. Pretty seemed trivial compared to alive. After tidying her classroom, Grace drove to the middle school to collect Lucas. At 8, he was all lanky limbs and boundless energy, with Olivia's dimples and light brown hair that flopped over his forehead no matter how often it was trimmed. "Mom," he called, spotting her car. His friends flanked him. The popular crowd, naturally. Lucas had Olivia's charisma too, drawing people to him effortlessly. "How was the math test?" Grace asked as he climbed in. "Easy," Lucas said, buckling his seatbelt. "Can we stop for ice cream? I got an A on my history project too." Grace laughed. "Nice try. We have dinner with Ryan tonight, remember?" "Oh yeah," Lucas brightened. "Is he bringing me something from Japan?" Ryan had just returned from a medical conference in Tokyo. Over the years, his friendship had become one of the constants in Grace's life. After her treatment ended, she had expected their relationship to fade naturally, doctor and patient moving on with their lives. Instead, it had deepened into something she hadn't anticipated. Not romance. Neither was ready for that. Ryan had his own painful history, a fiancé who died of leukemia days before their wedding, but they'd found comfort in each other's company, in shared meals and conversations about books, in his genuine interest in Lucas's development. "Let's not expect gifts," Grace cautioned. Lucas grinned. "But he always brings something cool." He wasn't wrong. Ryan had a knack for finding educational toys and books that captured Lucas's imagination. Not surprising, given Ryan's own background as the heir to the Clark Enterprises fortune. Unlike many wealthy heirs, Ryan had chosen medicine over business, using his family's resources to fund research and clinical trials. Grace hadn't known about his connection to the Clark family until their third dinner together, when a business magazine with his father's face on the cover sat on his coffee table. "You never mentioned you were that Clark," Grace had said, surprised. Ryan had shrugged. Would it have made a difference? It might have, given the Clark-Walker rivalry she knew about from her time with Jonathan. But Grace had kept that connection to herself. Ryan still didn't know about Jonathan, and she preferred it that way. The past was better left buried that evening, as they sat in Ryan's favorite Italian restaurant. Grace watched Lucas animatedly describe his latest science project to Ryan, who listened with genuine interest. "The solar system is cool, but black holes are cooler," Lucas declared. "They can swallow entire stars." "True," Ryan agreed, "though some theories suggest they don't actually destroy matter, just transform it, like what happened to Mom's cancer cells," Lucas asked innocently. Grace nearly choked on her water. Lucas knew the basics of her illness, that she had been sick before, that doctors had made her better, but they rarely discussed it. Ryan recovered first. Something like that. The treatment transformed the dangerous cells into harmless ones. Lucas nodded, satisfied, and turned his attention to the dessert menu. Ryan's eyes met Grace's over the table. "Smart kid," he said softly. "Gets that from his mom." The familiar guilt pinched at Grace's heart. She had never explicitly told Ryan that Lucas wasn't her biological son, though she suspected he'd figured it out. They had an unspoken agreement about certain topics, her past in San Diego being one of them. Meanwhile, in the gleaming offices of Walker Developments, Jonathan Walker sat reviewing quarterly projections. At 44, he'd grown leaner, harder, the boyish charm replaced by a cool efficiency that intimidated competitors and employees alike. Business magazines called him ruthless, brilliant, driven. None mentioned the emptiness behind his eyes. "Mr. Walker, your father's attorney is here," his assistant announced. Jonathan looked up. "Send him in." Gerald Foster entered, carrying a leather portfolio. "Thank you for seeing me, Jonathan. I know you're busy. What's this about, Gerald? I thought all of my father's affairs were settled." Charles Walker had died 4 months earlier from a massive stroke. The funeral had been well attended. Business associates paying respects to the titan who'd shaped San Diego's skyline. Jonathan had stood dry-eyed as they lowered his father into the ground, feeling nothing but a vague sense of release. "Almost everything is settled," Gerald replied, opening the portfolio. "But I recently discovered something your father left with me years ago, with instructions to deliver it to you in the event of his death." He handed Jonathan a sealed envelope. "He was very specific that you should receive this alone." After Gerald left, Jonathan stared at the envelope, his father's bold handwriting spelling out his name. Finally, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a smaller envelope. The note read simply, "You deserve to know the truth. I'm sorry, Dad." The smaller envelope contained photos. Surveillance photos of Grace from before their breakup. Grace entering a medical building. Grace sitting in a waiting room. Fear evident on her face. Grace speaking with a doctor, her expression devastated. Attached was a medical report with Grace's name, highlighting terms like aggressive tumor and treatment options. The date on the report was 3 days before her birthday party, the day Jonathan had publicly humiliated her as part of his test. The room seemed to tilt. Jonathan gripped the edge of his desk, nauseated. Grace had been diagnosed with cancer days before he'd betrayed her, and his father had known. A handwritten note on the medical report, in Charles's unmistakable script. "She's using this to trap you. Classic gold digger move. Create sympathy, ensure commitment. Don't fall for it." Jonathan closed his eyes, bile rising in his throat. His father had known Grace was sick and had deliberately kept it from him, twisting it to reinforce his own cynical worldview. All these years, Jonathan had comforted himself with the belief that Grace had simply moved on, found happiness elsewhere. The thought that she might have been fighting for her life, alone, while he was testing her loyalty was unbearable. He picked up the phone. "Dave, I need you to find someone for me. Grace Thompson, last known residence was Sacramento, about 6 years ago. She might be using another name now." "The Grace Thompson?" Dave asked carefully. Everyone at Walker Developments knew better than to mention her name around Jonathan. "Yes, it's important. What should I tell her if I find her?" Jonathan stared at the medical report, at the photos of Grace looking terrified and alone. "Nothing, just find her. I'll take it from there." As he hung up, Jonathan wondered what he would say to Grace if he found her. What possible words could make up for what he'd done? And would she even listen? In Sacramento, Grace tucked Lucas into bed, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Mom," Lucas asked sleepily, "is Ryan going to be my dad someday?" The question caught her off guard. "Why do you ask that?" Lucas shrugged. "Tommy's mom got married again, and now he has a dad. I just wondered." Grace sat on the edge of his bed. "Ryan is a good friend to both of us, but I don't know what the future holds." "But you like him, right?" "I do," Grace admitted. "Very much." "Good," Lucas mumbled, already drifting off. "Because I like him too." Grace kissed his forehead and turned off the light, wondering why Lucas's innocent question had stirred such complicated feelings. Maybe because for the first time in years, she was allowing herself to imagine a future that included someone other than just her and Lucas. What she didn't know was that 300 miles away, Jonathan Walker was staring at her medical records, the full horror of what he'd done finally crashing down on him and making plans to upend that carefully constructed future. It took Jonathan's investigators 3 weeks to find Grace in the end. It wasn't particularly difficult. She hadn't changed her name or gone into hiding. She'd simply built a quiet life far from San Diego, teaching at Westlake Academy under her own name. With a modest home in a good school district, Jonathan sat in his car outside the restaurant, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The Promise was Sacramento's newest upscale dining establishment, and according to his investigator, Grace had reservations there tonight. with Dr. Ryan Clark. The name had sent Jonathan down a rabbit hole of research. Dr. Clark wasn't just any doctor. He was the heir to Clark Enterprises, Walker Development's biggest competitor. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be random. Had Clark sought Grace out because of her connection to the Walkers? Was their relationship personal or strategic? Jonathan hated himself for the suspicion, but old habits died hard. The November rain created a silver curtain around his car, matching his mood. He'd come to Sacramento without a clear plan, driven by the need to see Grace with his own eyes, to confirm she was alive and well after her battle with cancer. Whether he would approach her remained undecided. Perhaps just seeing her would be enough. At 8 o'clock, Jonathan finally entered the Promise. The maitre d' led him to a table with a good view of the entrance, but partially concealed by a decorative pillar. He ordered scotch, neat, and waited. They arrived at 8:30. Grace, Dr. Clark, and a boy who could only be the child Dave had mentioned years ago. Jonathan's breath caught at the sight of Grace. 8 years had transformed the young woman he'd known into something more refined, more self-possessed. She wore a simple navy dress that accentuated her slender figure, her hair shorter than he remembered. She looked healthy, beautiful, completely recovered from the illness that might have killed her. Ryan Clark was equally striking. Tall, athletic, with prematurely silver hair that somehow added to his distinguished appearance. He held Grace's chair with practiced ease, his hand lingering briefly on her shoulder. The gesture spoke of familiarity, of years of shared moments. The boy sat across from Grace, his back to Jonathan. Even from behind, Jonathan could see he was well-mannered, sitting straight, placing his napkin in his lap without being reminded. He looked about 8, the right age if Grace had taken custody of him around the time of their breakup. Jonathan sipped his scotch, watching them order. They looked like a family, comfortable, connected, happy. His presence here suddenly seemed invasive, selfish even. What right did he have to disrupt the life Grace had carefully constructed from the ashes of what he'd destroyed? He was about to leave when the boy turned in his seat, scanning the restaurant with the natural curiosity of children. Jonathan froze as the child's gaze passed over him, then returned, lingering. The boy tilted his head slightly, a gesture so reminiscent of Grace that it made Jonathan's chest ache. "Mama," the boy said, loud enough to carry across the quiet restaurant. "That man over there keeps staring at you." Grace's head snapped up. Following her son's pointing finger, her eyes met Jonathan's across the room, and the color drained from her face. The wine glass she'd been lifting to her lips tilted dangerously before Ryan steadied her hand. "Grace?" Ryan asked, concern evident in his voice. "What's wrong?" Jonathan stood, his legs moving of their own accord. He approached their table slowly, giving Grace time to compose herself, to tell him to leave if that's what she wanted. "Hello, Grace," he said when he reached them, his voice rougher than he intended. "Jonathan," a whisper, disbelief coloring the familiar syllables of his name. Ryan looked between them, realization dawning. "Jonathan Walker," he said evenly. "This is unexpected. I apologize for the intrusion," Jonathan replied, unable to take his eyes off Grace. "I didn't plan to approach you. I just needed to see that you were okay." "I'm fine," Grace said, recovering her composure. As you can see, the boy watched this exchange with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mom?" he asked uncertainly. "Lucas, this is an old friend from San Diego, Mr. Walker." Grace's voice was remarkably steady. "Jonathan, this is my son, Lucas. Son, not nephew." The distinction wasn't lost on Jonathan. This child was her son in every way that mattered. "Nice to meet you, Lucas," Jonathan said. Offering his hand, the boy shook it solemnly, his grip surprisingly firm for a child. "Do you build buildings?" Lucas asked. "I saw a building with your name on it in a magazine at Dr. Ryan's house." Jonathan glanced at Ryan, who met his gaze without flinching. So Clark had been tracking Walker developments. "Interesting. I do build buildings," Jonathan confirmed. Among other things, an awkward silence fell over the table. Jonathan knew he should leave, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. He had so many questions, so many things he needed to say to Grace. Ryan cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time," he suggested diplomatically. "Lucas has school tomorrow and it's getting late." Of course, Jonathan said quickly. I apologize again for interrupting your dinner. It's fine, Grace said, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. It was a surprise to see you, Jonathan. I'm staying at the Grand, Jonathan said, taking out a business card and placing it on the table. I'll be in Sacramento for a few days, if you'd be willing to meet and talk. I'd appreciate it. Grace stared at the card but didn't touch it. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, Jonathan said softly. Just one conversation after that. If you never want to see me again, I'll understand. Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly at the intensity in Jonathan's voice. His hand moved imperceptibly closer to Grace's on the table. Grace doesn't owe you anything, he said quietly. You're right, she doesn't, Jonathan agreed. But I owe her an explanation. And an apology. Lucas watched this exchange with the unsettling perception of children. Did you do something bad to my mom? He asked Jonathan directly. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Jonathan met the boy's eyes, seeing Grace in them. Yes, he admitted. I did a long time ago. And I've regretted it every day since. Grace inhaled sharply. Lucas, that's enough questions, she said firmly. Mr. Walker is leaving now. Jonathan nodded, knowing he'd pushed as far as he could tonight. Goodbye, Grace. It was good to see you looking so well. He hesitated, then added, You have a wonderful son. As he walked away, he heard Lucas ask, Mom, why are you crying? Jonathan didn't look back to see Grace's response. He paid his bill quickly and escaped into the rainy night, his mind racing. She was alive, healthy. The cancer that might have killed her had been defeated. That knowledge alone made the trip worthwhile, even if she never agreed to meet with him. But the tears in her eyes when he mentioned Lucas, what did those mean? And why had Clark been so protective? Was he just looking out for Grace? Or was there more to their relationship than Jonathan had observed? Back in his hotel room, Jonathan stood at the window, watching the rain transform Sacramento streets into flowing rivers of light. He'd come here seeking absolution, or at least the chance to explain. Now he wasn't sure what he was seeking. Perhaps Grace had been right to refuse a meeting. What good would dredging up the past do, except possibly hurt her all over again? She had clearly moved on, built a good life for herself and Lucas. Maybe the kindest thing would be to leave without forcing a confrontation. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Coffee? Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Riverside Cafe. No signature, but it could only be from Grace. Jonathan closed his eyes, relief washing over him. One chance. That was all he needed. What he didn't know was that Grace was lying awake in her own bed across town, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake, or that Ryan Clark was making a late-night call to his family's legal team, quietly investigating Jonathan Walker's sudden appearance in Sacramento, or that little Lucas, supposed to be sleeping, was instead Googling Jonathan Walker on the tablet he wasn't allowed to have in his bedroom, his young mind piecing together a puzzle whose full picture he couldn't yet comprehend. Jonathan arrived at Riverside Cafe 30 minutes early, selecting a table with a view of both the entrance and the Sacramento River flowing lazily beyond the patio. He ordered coffee but left it untouched, rehearsing what he would say when Grace arrived. The explanations he'd practiced on the flight to Sacramento now seemed inadequate, hollow. How do you apologize for destroying someone's life at their most vulnerable moment? At precisely 10 a.m., Grace entered the cafe. She wore jeans and a simple blue blouse, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Casual, yet somehow more intimidating than if she'd arrived in business attire. This wasn't Grace Thompson, Jonathan Walker's ex-girlfriend. This was Grace Thompson, survivor, mother, a woman who had rebuilt her life from scratch. She spotted him immediately and approached with measured steps. Jonathan stood, nearly knocking over his cold coffee. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Grace ignored the gesture, pulling out her own chair and sitting. "I have 45 minutes before my next appointment," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You wanted to talk. So talk." Jonathan sat down, momentarily at a loss, despite his preparation. Up close, he could see the faint lines around her eyes, evidence of battles fought and won. She was more beautiful now than she had been at 25, strength evident in every angle of her face. "I found out about your diagnosis," he said finally. "The cancer. You were diagnosed right before your birthday party. Grace's expression didn't change. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I was going to, after the party. Her eyes met his, unflinching. But you had other plans that night. The simplicity of her statement hit him like a physical blow. Grace, I didn't know if I had... What? She interrupted. You wouldn't have publicly humiliated me. You wouldn't have betrayed 5 years of trust and love. She shook her head. Don't rewrite history, Jonathan. You made your choice. It wasn't what you think, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. It was my father. He convinced me to test you, to see if you truly loved me, or if you were after the Walker fortune. That kiss with Amber. It was staged. All of it was staged. Grace stared at him, disbelief turning to slow, simmering anger. You tested me, like I was some product to be quality checked before purchase. I know how it sounds. Do you? Her voice remained low, but the intensity of it silenced him. Do you have any idea what that night was like for me? I had just found out I might be dying. I had just learned my sister was dead, leaving her baby with no one. And then the man I had loved and trusted for 5 years publicly cheated on me at my own birthday party. She leaned forward. So no, Jonathan. I don't think you do know how it sounds. Jonathan swallowed hard. I found out recently that my father knew about your diagnosis. He kept it from me, used it to reinforce his theory that you were manipulating me. And you believed him. Not a question. I was weak, Jonathan admitted. Insecure, he preyed on my deepest fear, that I'd end up abandoned and alone, like he was when my mother left. A server approached to take Grace's order, but she waved him away. Jonathan noticed her hands were trembling slightly, the only visible sign of her emotional state. What happened after you left San Diego? He asked softly. Grace sighed, seeming to decide how much to share. I moved to Sacramento, started treatment, took custody of Lucas. Lucas is your sister's son. Grace nodded. Olivia died in a car accident when he was 3 months old. There was no father in the picture. I'm sorry about your sister, Jonathan said sincerely. And I'm sorry you had to face cancer alone. If I had known... But you didn't. Grace cut him off. And I wasn't alone. I had friends who stepped up, and I had Ryan. The mention of Clark made Jonathan's jaw tighten. Yes, Dr. Clark. Quite a coincidence. Him being your doctor. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Just that of all the oncologists in California, you happen to find one whose family company is Walker Development's biggest competitor. Grace's eyes narrowed. Ryan saved my life. He got me into a clinical trial when I couldn't afford treatment. He supported me through the worst experience of my life without asking for anything in return. Don't you dare imply there was some ulterior motive? I'm sorry, Jonathan said quickly. I didn't mean to suggest... He stopped, realizing he was making things worse. You're right. I have no right to question anything about your life after I destroyed it. Grace checked her watch. 25 minutes left. Is there a point to this conversation, Jonathan? Beyond reopening old wounds? Jonathan took a deep breath. I recently found out that my father deliberately manipulated our breakup. He hired Amber, created evidence that you were unfaithful, all to prove his theory that everyone is ultimately self-serving. He met her eyes. I know it doesn't change what happened, but I thought you should know the truth. Evidence that I was unfaithful. Grace's voice was dangerously quiet. What are you talking about? Jonathan hesitated, then pulled out his phone, opening a folder of photos his father's assistant had given him after Charles's death. My father showed me these, claimed they proved you were seeing someone else. Grace took the phone, her expression changing from anger to disbelief as she swiped through photos of herself with various men, all deliberately framed to suggest intimacy, all completely innocent in reality. This is Dr. Patel, my first oncologist in San Diego, she said, pointing to one photo. This is my neighbor's son who helped me move furniture. This is the counselor from the grief support group I joined after Olivia died. She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your father had me followed. Yes, Jonathan admitted, shame washing over him. And I believed him instead of trusting you. It's the greatest regret of my life. Grace handed back the phone, her hand steady now. So Charles Walker destroyed our relationship because... What? He couldn't stand to see you happy. He was projecting his own failed marriage onto you. Essentially. Yes, Jonathan said. He truly believed he was protecting me from what he'd experienced with my mother. It was twisted, but in his mind, he was being a good father. Grace was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. And you're telling me this now because you deserve to know the truth. Because I've spent 8 years wondering what happened to you, if you were okay, if you ever thought of me. He hesitated. And because I never stopped loving you, Grace. The words hung between them. Too honest, too raw. Grace flinched as if he'd raised a hand to her. Don't, she said sharply. You don't get to say that. Not after 8 years. Not after everything. I know, Jonathan said quickly. I'm not expecting anything. I just needed you to know. Grace stood abruptly. Well, now I know. Your father was a manipulative bastard who ruined our lives because of his own issues. You were too weak to trust your own judgment over his. And I've spent 8 years building a life that has no place for either of those realities. She gathered her purse. Goodbye, Jonathan. Grace, wait, Jonathan called as she turned to leave. There's something else you should know. She paused, not turning back. My father's assistant, Mark Whitman, is dying. Pancreatic cancer. He was the one who gave me those photos, who told me about my father's manipulation. He said he couldn't die with that on his conscience. Jonathan stood. He asked to speak with you, to apologize in person for his role in what happened. Grace turned slowly. Mark Whitman, Mark. The older man who worked directly for your father. Jonathan nodded. He's in hospice care here in Sacramento. It's why I came now. He doesn't have much time left. And you expect me to, what, absolve him on his deathbed? I don't expect anything, Jonathan said quietly. I'm just delivering the message. What you do with it is entirely your choice. Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, text me the address, and walked out of the cafe without looking back. Jonathan sank back into his chair, emotionally drained. The conversation had gone both better and worse than he'd expected. She hadn't forgiven him. He hadn't really expected her to. But she hadn't completely shut the door either. As he paid the bill, his phone buzzed with a text from Dave back in San Diego. Call me ASAP. Something you need to know about Clark. Grace sat in her car outside Mercy Hospice Center, rain drumming on the roof. She'd been there for 20 minutes, unable to make herself go inside. The address Jonathan had texted her matched the one on her phone's GPS. This was definitely where Mark Whitman was spending his final days. What was she doing here? What possible good could come from confronting a dying man who had helped destroy her life? Her phone rang. Ryan's name flashed on the screen. Hey, she answered, grateful for the distraction. Where are you? Ryan asked without preamble. I stopped by the school, but they said you called in sick. I had some personal business to take care of. She hadn't told Ryan about her coffee meeting with Jonathan, or about Mark Whitman. Is this about Walker showing up last night? Grace sighed. Yes. A pause, then. Do you want to talk about it? Not really, not yet. Grace, Ryan's voice softened. Be careful. The Walkers aren't exactly known for their integrity. Remember who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Grace replied sharply, then immediately regretted her tone. I'm sorry, it's just complicated. I understand. Just know I'm here if you need me. Another pause. Lucas was asking about him this morning. What did he say? He wanted to know if Walker was someone special from your past. He's a perceptive kid, Grace. He picked up on the tension. Grace closed her eyes. What did you tell him? That some questions are for his mother to answer, but you might want to prepare something. He's been Googling Walker developments. Great, Grace muttered. Thanks for the heads up. After hanging up, Grace finally gathered the courage to enter the hospice. The receptionist directed her to room 214. As she approached, she saw Jonathan sitting in a chair outside the door, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, surprise and something like relief crossing his face. You came. I'm not sure why, Grace admitted. Is he awake? Lucid? The nurse says that might not last. Grace nodded, steeling herself. I want to speak with him alone. Of course. Jonathan stood, gesturing to the door. I'll wait out here. Mark Whitman had aged 20 years since Grace had last seen him. Cancer had hollowed his cheeks and sunken his eyes, but recognition flickered in them as she entered. Mrs. Thompson, he said. his voice a dry whisper. "You came, Mr. Whitman," Grace acknowledged, taking the chair beside his bed. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "More sorry than I can ever express." Grace studied him dispassionately. "Jonathan tells me you helped his father destroy our relationship." Mark nodded weakly. "Charles, he was obsessed with protecting Jonathan from what he saw as gold diggers. When you got sick, Charles was convinced it was a ploy for sympathy, a way to lock Jonathan into marriage. And you went along with it." "I did." Mark's eyes filled with tears. "I falsified evidence, hired the model, set up the whole charade." He reached for a glass of water with shaking hands. Grace didn't help him. "Charles was more than my boss. He saved me from financial ruin decades ago. I owed him everything. So your loyalty to him was worth destroying 2 innocent people's lives." Mark shook his head slightly. "No, it wasn't. I've had a lot of time to reflect on my choices. Too much time." He gestured weakly at his withered body. "Karma, perhaps." "I don't believe in karma," Grace said. "Just choices and consequences. Mine were wrong. Unforgivably wrong." Mark's breathing grew labored. "I should have told Jonathan the truth years ago. But Charles, he had a hold on people, made us believe we needed him more than we needed our own integrity." Grace watched him struggle for breath, feeling nothing but a hollow exhaustion. Why tell the truth now? Why drag it all back up after 8 years? Because Jonathan deserves to know his father's true nature. And because, Mark's voice cracked, because I couldn't die with this sin on my conscience. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Mrs. Thompson. I just needed you to know it wasn't Jonathan's fault. Not really. Grace stood. It was his choice to trust his father over me, his choice to test me instead of talking to me. Don't absolve him of responsibility to ease your conscience, Mr. Whitman. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. But thank you for telling the truth, even if it's 8 years too late. Jonathan stood as she exited, his face questioning. Are you okay? No, Grace said honestly. I'm not okay. None of this is okay. She walked past him toward the exit. Jonathan followed her out into the rain. Grace, please, can we talk? We talked this morning, she said, pulling her coat tighter against the downpour. There's nothing more to say. There's everything to say, Jonathan insisted, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. I know I hurt you unforgivably. I know I can't undo what happened. But please don't walk away again without letting me at least try to explain. Explain what? Grace whirled to face him. That you were manipulated? That you were insecure? I understood all that this morning, Jonathan. Understanding doesn't change anything. It changes everything. If my father hadn't interfered, if you had trusted me, your father couldn't have interfered. Grace shot back. That's what you're not getting. The problem wasn't just Charles. It was that after 5 years together, you still didn't trust me enough to believe in us. They stood facing each other in the pouring rain. 8 years of pain and regret swirling between them like floodwaters. You're right, Jonathan said finally. I didn't trust enough. I was afraid, terrified of being abandoned like my father was. It's not an excuse. It's just the truth. He took a step closer. But I've spent every day since then regretting what I did. Wondering where you were, if you were okay. His voice broke. If you had survived. The raw emotion in his voice pierced through Grace's carefully constructed defenses. Well, now you know, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. I survived. I built a new life. I moved on. With Ryan Clark, Jonathan said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Ryan has nothing to do with this. Doesn't he? He's been part of your life for what? 6 years? He's close to Lucas. You have dinner together regularly. He looks at you like... Jonathan stopped himself. Like what? Grace challenged. Like I used to look at you, Jonathan finished quietly. Like you're the center of his world. Grace shook her head, rain streaming down her face, mingling with tears she hadn't realized were falling. You don't get to be jealous, Jonathan. You don't get to care who's in my life now. I know, he said, his shoulders slumping. I know I don't have any right. But I can't help it, Grace. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. The words hung between them, almost visible in the rain-soaked air. Grace stared at him. This man who had once been her everything. This man who had broken her so completely, she'd had to rebuild herself from scratch. "Stop," she whispered. "Please stop saying that. It's the truth. The truth." Grace laughed bitterly. "The truth is, I had to fight for my life while dealing with a broken heart. The truth is, I raised Lucas alone, terrified I would die and leave him with no one. The truth is, you moved on with that model while I was having my skull cut open to remove a tumor." Jonathan flinched at each statement. "I didn't know, Grace. I swear to God, if I had known—" "But you didn't know because you didn't trust me enough to tell you," Grace interrupted. "That's the fundamental truth here, Jonathan, and I don't think I can ever get past that." She turned and walked to her car, fumbling with her keys, hands shaking from cold and emotion. "Grace," Jonathan called after her, desperation evident in his voice. "Please, just tell me one thing. Did you ever think of me in all these years? Did you ever wonder what might have been?" Grace paused, her hand on the car door. The honest answer was yes. In her darkest moments during treatment, she had longed for him. When Lucas took his first steps, she had instinctively reached for her phone to share the news, only to remember there was no one to call. Even now, seeing him soaked and miserable in the rain, something in her heart twisted painfully. But she couldn't admit that. Not to him. Not to herself. "Goodbye, Jonathan," she said instead, climbing into her car as she drove away. Grace glanced in her rearview mirror. Jonathan stood motionless in the downpour, watching her go, a solitary figure gradually disappearing in the gray curtain of rain. That night, as thunder crashed over Sacramento, Jonathan sat in his hotel room, a glass of scotch in hand, staring unseeing at the storm outside. His phone buzzed. Dave calling again about whatever he'd discovered about Ryan Clark. Jonathan ignored it. Nothing mattered, except the crushing realization that he had truly, irrevocably lost Grace, not to cancer, not to Ryan Clark, but to his own fatal weakness. Across town, Grace sat in her darkened living room, Lucas asleep upstairs, listening to the same storm and wondering why. After all these years, after everything Jonathan had done, his words still had the power to shake the foundations of the life she had so carefully rebuilt. The accident happened just after midnight. Jonathan had finally returned Dave's call, learning that Ryan Clark had been tracking Walker developments for years, accumulating data that could potentially be used against them in business negotiations. The revelation shouldn't have surprised him. The Clark-Walker rivalry was legendary in California real estate circles, but it hit Jonathan like a betrayal nonetheless. Had Clark only helped Grace because of her connection to Walker developments? Had their entire relationship been built on strategic calculation? Desperate to clear his head, Jonathan had taken his rental car out into the storm. The rain lashed against the windshield as he drove aimlessly through Sacramento's empty streets, his mind replaying every moment with Grace since their chance encounter at the Promise. He never saw the truck that ran the red light. The impact was catastrophic. Metal screaming against metal, glass shattering, the world turning upside down as Jonathan's car flipped twice before coming to rest against a concrete barrier. Pain exploded through his body, then merciful darkness. Grace woke to her phone ringing at 2:37 a.m., unknown number. "Hello?" she answered groggily. "Is this Grace Thompson?" a professional female voice asked. "Yes. This is Nurse Martinez from Sacramento Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about Jonathan Walker. You're listed as his emergency contact." Grace sat bolt upright. "What? I'm not. We haven't been together in 8 years." "I see." The nurse sounded confused. "Well, his phone was badly damaged in the accident, but it opened to your text message about meeting at Riverside Cafe. It's the only contact information we could find." "Accident." Grace's mouth went dry. "What happened? Is he okay?" "Mr. Walker was in a serious car accident. He's in critical condition. The doctors are taking him into emergency surgery now." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "I'll be right there," Grace heard herself say, already reaching for clothes. She called Ryan as she drove through the still raging storm. Explaining the situation as calmly as she could, he offered to meet her at the hospital and watch Lucas when he woke, saving her from having to call a sitter. "Are you sure you want to go?" Ryan asked, concern evident in his voice. "After everything he did to you." "I don't know," Grace admitted, "but I can't just do nothing." When she arrived at the hospital, A grim-faced doctor met her in the surgical waiting room. "Ms. Thompson, I'm Dr. Patel, the neurosurgeon treating Mr. Walker." "How is he?" Grace asked, bracing herself. "He's still in surgery. The impact caused significant trauma. Broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding." The doctor hesitated. "But our primary concern is the head injury. There's considerable swelling in his brain. We've placed him in a medically induced coma to give his brain time to heal." "Will he survive?" Grace's voice sounded strange to her own ears. Detached. "It's too early to tell," Dr. Patel said honestly. "The next 48 hours are critical." Grace sank into a waiting room chair. "I don't understand why I'm listed as his emergency contact." "You weren't officially," the doctor explained. "But when the paramedics found him, he was semi-conscious. Your name was the only thing he said before losing consciousness." Grace closed her eyes, absorbing this information. Even at the edge of death, Jonathan had called for her. "Is there anyone else I should contact? Family? Colleagues?" Grace thought of Charles, then remembered he was dead. Jonathan had never mentioned other family. His assistant Dave in San Diego, I don't have his number, but he works at Walker Developments. "We'll try to reach him," the doctor promised before being called back to surgery. Grace remained in the waiting room as hours passed, watching rain streak down the windows as dawn gradually lightened the sky. Ryan arrived with a sleeping Lucas wrapped in a blanket, settling the boy carefully on the waiting room couch. "Any news?" Ryan asked, handing Grace a cup of coffee. She shook her head. "Still in surgery." Ryan studied her face. "Grace, I need to tell you something about Walker. Something I should have told you years ago." Grace looked up, noting the unusual tension in Ryan's expression. "What is it?" "When you first came to me as a patient," Ryan began carefully, "I recognized your name. Everyone in my family knew about Jonathan Walker's long-term girlfriend. The Walkers and Clarks have been rivals for decades." "I know that," Grace said. "What's your point?" "My father suggested I use your connection to gain competitive information about Walker Developments," Ryan admitted, not meeting her eyes. "He thought I could leverage your relationship with Jonathan to our advantage." Grace stared at him, disbelief turning to anger. Is that why you helped me? To use me?" "No." Ryan grabbed her hand. "Absolutely not. I refused my father's suggestion immediately, but I should have told you about it. I'm sorry I didn't." Grace withdrew her hand, processing this revelation. First Jonathan's betrayal, now learning that Ryan had hidden this from her for years. Was there anyone in her life who hadn't seen her as a pawn in some larger game? "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because Dave from Walker Developments called me last night," Ryan explained. "He's been investigating me, trying to prove I only helped you to hurt Walker Developments. I wanted you to hear the truth from me first." Before Grace could respond, Dr. Patel returned, looking exhausted, but cautiously optimistic. "We've managed to stabilize him," he reported. "The bleeding is under control, but he's still in critical condition. We'll keep him in the coma for at least 48 hours while we monitor the brain swelling." "Can I see him?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the request. "Briefly," the doctor agreed. "He's being moved to ICU now." Ryan stood. "I'll take Lucas home and get him ready for school. Call me if you need anything." Grace nodded, watching him leave with Lucas still sleeping in his arms. Their conversation wasn't over, but Jonathan's condition took precedence for now. The IQ was unnervingly quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors and the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator breathing for Jonathan. He looked nothing like the confident man who had approached her table at the Promise 2 days ago. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines, his face bruised and swollen, a surgical dressing covering part of his skull. Grace stood at the foot of his bed, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. This man had destroyed her life 8 years ago, had broken her heart when she was most vulnerable. Yet seeing him like this, broken, hovering between life and death, awakened something she'd thought long buried. The memory of love. "Ms. Thompson," a nurse touched her elbow gently. "You can sit with him if you'd like. Some studies suggest coma patients can hear when loved ones speak to them." "I'm not his loved one," Grace corrected automatically. It's complicated." The nurse smiled kindly. "Relationships usually are still. A familiar voice might help." Left alone with Jonathan, Grace hesitantly took the chair beside his bed. "I don't know if you can hear me," she began softly. "The nurse thinks you might." The steady beep of the heart monitor was her only response. "I don't know why I'm here," she continued. "By all rights, I should hate you after what you did. Maybe part of me still does." She watched his still face, searching for any sign of awareness. "But I didn't want you to be alone. No one should be alone like this." Hours passed. As Grace sat vigil, Dave called from San Diego, frantic with worry. Promising to fly up immediately, news of Jonathan Walker's accident had already made the business pages. CEO of Walker Developments in critical condition after Sacramento crash. Lucas called around lunchtime. "Mom, Ryan said you're at the hospital with that man from the restaurant. Is he going to be okay?" "The doctors aren't sure yet." "Sweetheart," Grace answered honestly. "Was he really important to you? Before I was born?" Grace's throat tightened. "Yes, he was. Very important." "Oh." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you looked sad when you saw him?" "It's complicated, Lucas. Grown-ups always say that when they don't want to explain," Lucas observed with the piercing insight of children. Grace smiled despite everything. "You're right. I promise we'll talk about it when I get home." For 3 days, Grace split her time between the hospital, home, and work, catching brief moments of sleep when she could. Jonathan remained stable but unresponsive, the doctors cautiously optimistic as the brain swelling gradually subsided. On the 4th day, as Grace sat reading aloud from a novel she'd found in the hospital gift shop, Jonathan's fingers twitched. "Jonathan," she put the book down, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Confusion, pain, and then recognition moved across his face as his gaze focused on Grace. "You're here," he whispered, his voice raspy from the ventilator tube that had been removed the previous day. "I'm here," Grace confirmed, pressing the call button for the nurse. Why? The simple question contained worlds of meaning. Grace had asked herself the same thing countless times over the past 4 days. Why was she sitting vigil for the man who had broken her heart? Why couldn't she just walk away? "Because," she said finally, "8 years ago, when I needed someone, no one was there for me. I couldn't do that to you, even after everything." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. "Grace," he whispered, reaching weakly for her hand. "I'm so sorry for everything." Grace hesitated, then took his hand. "I know," she said softly. "I know you are." Jonathan's recovery was slow and frustrating. The doctors had been blunt about the extent of his injuries. Traumatic brain injury, multiple broken ribs, a shattered femur, internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery. He would live, but the road back would be long and arduous. "You're lucky to be alive," Dr. Patel told him during morning rounds a week after the accident. "The impact should have killed you instantly." Jonathan glanced at Grace, who sat quietly in the corner of the hospital room. She had been a constant presence since he'd awakened from the coma, arriving each day after dropping Lucas at school and staying until evening. They hadn't spoken much about the past or their feelings. Jonathan was often too exhausted or medicated for deep conversation, but her mere presence felt like more than he deserved. "When can I go home?" Jonathan asked. "Not for at least another week," Dr. Patel replied. "And even then, you'll need intensive rehabilitation. The brain injury has affected your motor control on the left side, and your leg will require physical therapy before you can bear weight on it." "I can arrange for private care in San Diego," Dave interjected from the doorway. He had flown up immediately after learning of the accident, and had been managing Walker Developments remotely from Jonathan's hospital room. "Actually," Dr. Patel said, "I wouldn't recommend traveling that distance for at least a month. Your brain needs time to heal without the stress of travel." Jonathan frowned. The thought of being stuck in Sacramento, away from his company, was concerning, but a smaller, more honest part of him recognized that being near Grace for a little longer wasn't entirely unwelcome. "I'll make arrangements for an extended stay," Dave said, already typing on his phone. "There's a medical rehabilitation center near here with excellent reviews," after the doctor left. Grace stood to gather her things. "I should pick up Lucas from school." "Thank you," Jonathan said, the words inadequate for everything he felt. "For being here, for not hating me, for everything." Grace paused. "I don't hate you, Jonathan. I never did. That would have been easier, actually. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, hating the vulnerability in his voice but unable to hide it. She nodded. "I'll be here." After she left, Dave gave Jonathan a pointed look. "She's been here every day, you know, even when you were in the coma." "I know," Jonathan said quietly. "And Clark? Where does he fit in all this?" Jonathan sighed. The rivalry between the Walkers and Clark seemed trivial now, after nearly dying. "He saved her life, Dave. Whatever else he might have done. He gave Grace a chance to survive when I wasn't there for her." "Still," Dave persisted, "my sources confirm he's been gathering information on Walker developments for years, using his relationship with Grace." "Stop," Jonathan interrupted. "I don't care anymore, none of that matters." Dave looked surprised. "Of course it matters, the company." "I almost died, Dave," Jonathan said bluntly, and in what might have been my final moments. "I wasn't thinking about Walker developments or market share or beating the Clarks. I was thinking about Grace, about all the time I wasted without her, about how I threw away the only thing that ever really mattered to me." Dave was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I understand, but you should know that Clark arrived about an hour after you were brought in. He's been here almost as often as Grace." The next day, as promised, Grace returned. This time she wasn't alone. "This is Lucas," she said, ushering the boy into the room. "He wanted to meet you properly." Lucas approached the hospital bed with cautious curiosity. His resemblance to Grace, particularly around the eyes, was striking, though Jonathan knew now he was her nephew, not her biological son. "Hello, Mr. Walker," Lucas said formally. "Mom said I could come see you if I promised not to tire you out." Jonathan smiled. "It's nice to meet you properly, Lucas, and you can call me Jonathan." "Okay." Lucas studied the various machines and tubes. "Does all that stuff hurt, Lucas?" Grace admonished gently. "It's okay," Jonathan assured her. "Not too much, Lucas. The medicines help. Mom says you build really tall buildings," Lucas continued, his initial shyness evaporating. "Taller than the ones here in Sacramento." "I do," Jonathan confirmed. "Or at least, my company does." "That's cool. I want to be an architect when I grow up. Or maybe an astronaut. I haven't decided yet." Jonathan smiled at the boy's earnestness. "Both are excellent choices." While Lucas explored the hospital room with the boundless curiosity of childhood, Grace took her usual seat next to Jonathan's bed. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. "Better," Jonathan said, though it wasn't entirely true. The pain was constant, and the frustration of being physically helpless was wearing on him. "The doctors say I might be able to start physical therapy next week." Grace nodded. "That's good news." An awkward silence fell between them. There were so many things Jonathan wanted to say, questions he wanted to ask, but he was acutely aware of Lucas's presence just a few feet away. "Ryan told me about his father's suggestion," Grace said finally, her voice low, "about using me to get information on Walker developments." Jonathan tensed. "What did he say?" "That he refused. That he helped me because it was the right thing to do, not because of any corporate espionage." She met his eyes steadily. "I believe him." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I'd like to believe him too. But nothing," Jonathan said, surprising himself with the realization that he meant it. "He was there for you when I wasn't. He helped save your life. Nothing else matters." Grace studied him for a long moment. "You've changed. Nearly dying will do that," Jonathan said with a weak smile. "Makes you reassess your priorities." Lucas returned to Grace's side, tugging at her sleeve. "Mom, can I show Jonathan my science project pictures?" "If he's not too tired," Grace replied, glancing at Jonathan. "I'd love to see them," Jonathan said sincerely, as Lucas enthusiastically showed off photos of his solar system model, complete with a papier-mâché black hole that had won first prize. Jonathan found himself deeply moved by this glimpse into the life Grace had built without him. Lucas was bright, well-adjusted, clearly adored by his mother. Grace had done an amazing job raising him alone, all while battling cancer and building a new career. The pride he felt for her accomplishments was tinged with grief for everything he had missed, everything he had thrown away with his distrust and insecurity. "Jonathan?" Grace's voice broke into his thoughts. "Are you okay? You look pale." "Just tired," he admitted. "But please, don't leave yet." Grace checked her watch. "We can stay a little longer." Lucas has homework, but he can start it here. As Lucas settled at the small table in the corner with his math workbook, Grace leaned closer to Jonathan. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," she said quietly. "Anything. Why were you driving in that storm? Dave said you left your hotel after midnight. Where were you going?" Jonathan hesitated. The truth was both simple and complicated. Nowhere. Everywhere. I was just driving, trying to clear my head after our conversation at the hospice. "You could have been killed," Grace said, an unexpected edge in her voice. "I know. I wasn't thinking clearly." He reached for her hand. "Grace, seeing you again after all these years, it brought everything back. Everything I lost, everything I threw away." Grace didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't return the pressure of his fingers either. "Jonathan, I know," he interrupted gently. "I know you've moved on. I know you have a life that doesn't include me, and I have no right to disrupt that. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in 8 years." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't do this." "I'm not asking for anything," Jonathan assured her hastily. "I don't expect forgiveness or a second chance. I just needed you to know." Before Grace could respond, the door opened and Ryan Clark entered. Freezing momentarily at the tableau before him, Grace and Jonathan with clasped hands, tears in Grace's eyes, Lucas oblivious at the table. "Ryan," Grace said, quickly withdrawing her hand from Jonathan's. "I didn't expect you." "I had a break between patients," Ryan explained, his expression carefully neutral. "Thought I'd check in." He nodded to Jonathan. "Walker, glad to see you're improving." "Thank you," Jonathan replied with equal formality. "And thank you for looking after Grace and Lucas during all of this." An unspoken understanding passed between the two men, whatever their families' business rivalries. Whatever their personal feelings for Grace, they were united in wanting what was best for her. "Mom," Lucas called from the table. "I finished my math. Can we go get ice cream now like you promised?" Grace looked relieved at the interruption. "Yes, we should go." She gathered her purse, avoiding Jonathan's eyes. "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon." After they left, Ryan lingered, studying Jonathan thoughtfully. "She sat by your bed for 3 days straight, while you were in the coma." "I know," Jonathan said quietly. "I don't deserve it." Ryan nodded. "No, you don't." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But for what it's worth, in all the years I've known her, I've never seen her look at anyone the way she looks at you. Even now, after everything." With that cryptic observation, he left, leaving Jonathan alone with a fragile, dangerous thing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 8 years: hope. 3 weeks after the accident, Jonathan was transferred to Lakeside Rehabilitation Center, a modern facility on the outskirts of Sacramento, with gardens that sloped gently down to a small lake. It was a significant improvement over the hospital, with private rooms, large windows, and therapists who pushed him relentlessly toward recovery. Grace continued to visit daily, often bringing Lucas, whose initial curiosity about Jonathan had blossomed into genuine affection. The boy would regale Jonathan with stories from school, updates on his science projects, and questions about building design that revealed a keen, analytical mind. "He reminds me of you," Jonathan told Grace one afternoon as they watched Lucas skipping stones across the lake. "The way he thinks, the way he approaches problems." Grace smiled. "He has a lot of his mother in him too. Olivia was fearless, spontaneous. Everything I wasn't." "You're plenty brave," Jonathan said quietly. "You faced cancer alone, raised a child by yourself, started over from nothing." "I wasn't alone," Grace corrected. "I had Ryan, Mrs. Chen, friends I made along the way." The mention of Ryan still caused a small twist in Jonathan's chest, though he'd come to respect the man who had saved Grace's life and supported her through her darkest days. Ryan continued to visit the rehabilitation center occasionally, maintaining a professional courtesy with Jonathan that sometimes bordered on friendliness. "Any word on when you can return to San Diego?" Grace asked, changing the subject. "Another 2 weeks, the doctors think," Jonathan replied. "My left side is still weak but improving, and I'll need to use a wheelchair for a while longer before graduating to crutches." Grace nodded, watching Lucas successfully skip a stone 5 times. What will you do then? Go back to Walker Developments as if nothing happened? Jonathan shook his head. No, this experience has changed everything. I can't go back to living the way I was before. He turned to face her. I've been thinking about selling my controlling interest in the company. What? Grace looked genuinely shocked. But Walker Developments is your life, your legacy. It was my father's legacy, Jonathan corrected, and not a particularly admirable one. Charles built that company on ruthless competition, on seeing weaknesses and exploiting them. Even his relationship with me was based on manipulation and distrust. So what would you do instead? Jonathan smiled. I've been talking with Dave about restructuring, keeping a minority stake, but using the majority of my shares to create a foundation. Healthcare initiatives, educational opportunities for underprivileged kids, community development. That sounds wonderful, Grace said, studying him with new eyes. But so different from the Jonathan I knew. I hope I am different, he said seriously. Nearly dying has a way of clarifying what's really important. He hesitated, then added, Actually, I was hoping to get your input on the foundation, with your background in education and your experience with the healthcare system. Your perspective would be invaluable. Before Grace could respond, Lucas came running up, dripping wet from an apparent miscalculation with a particularly heavy stone. Mom, I fell in, he announced, more excited than upset about his soaked condition. Lucas Thompson, those were your good shoes, Grace scolded, though her eyes betrayed her amusement. I'll dry eventually, Lucas said philosophically, dropping onto the bench beside Jonathan's wheelchair. Jonathan, did you see my last throw? 5 skips? I did, Jonathan confirmed. Very impressive technique. Can you skip stones? I used to be pretty good, Jonathan said. When my leg heals, I'll show you my technique. Lucas beamed at this promise of future stone-skipping lessons, and something in Jonathan's chest tightened at the simple acceptance in the boy's eyes. Lucas had no idea of the complicated history between his mother and Jonathan. He saw only a new friend who built cool buildings, and was interested in his thoughts about black holes and architecture. Time to go, Lucas, Grace said, checking her watch. You need to change before your piano lesson. Do we have to? Lucas groaned. I want to stay with Jonathan. We'll come back tomorrow, Grace promised. Jonathan needs his rest. After they left, Jonathan's physical therapist arrived for their afternoon session. The work was grueling, retraining muscles, rebuilding strength, pushing through pain. But Jonathan attacked it with determination, driven by the desire to become whole again, not just for himself, but for the glimpse of a future he was beginning to allow himself to imagine. That evening, as Jonathan ate dinner in the rehabilitation center's common room, Ryan Clark appeared, taking the seat across from him without invitation. Walker, he greeted with a nod. Clark, Jonathan replied. This is unexpected. I've been meaning to talk to you. Ryan placed a file folder on the table between them. About Grace. Jonathan tensed. What about her? She's been happier these past few weeks than I've seen her in years, Ryan said directly. Even with the stress of your accident, the disruption to her routine, the late nights at the hospital, there's a light in her eyes that wasn't there before. Jonathan wasn't sure how to respond. I don't understand why you're telling me this, Ryan sighed. Because I care about her, deeply, and for a long time. I hoped we might eventually become more than friends. He met Jonathan's eyes squarely. But I've come to realize that isn't going to happen, not while you're back in her life. Grace hasn't given me any reason to believe. She doesn't need to, Ryan interrupted. I see it every time she talks about you. Every time she comes back from visiting you, she's still in love with you, whether she's ready to admit it or not. Jonathan absorbed this, hope and disbelief warring within him. Why are you telling me this? Aren't the Clarks and Walkers supposed to be bitter rivals? Ryan smiled thinly. I think we've both learned that business rivalries are meaningless compared to what really matters in life. He pushed the folder toward Jonathan. This is Grace's complete medical history from her cancer treatment. I thought you should understand exactly what she went through while you were busy expanding Walker Developments. Jonathan stared at the folder, then slowly opened it. Inside were medical charts, treatment plans, scan results, and photographs. Grace in a hospital bed, her head bandaged after brain surgery. Grace with no hair, gaunt from chemotherapy, holding a baby Lucas. Grace in a radiation mask, her eyes visible and terrified through the cutouts. "My God," Jonathan whispered, his throat constricting. "1 in 3 patients with her type of tumor don't survive 5 years," Ryan said quietly. She was terrified she would die and leave Lucas alone, but she never gave up, never stopped fighting. Jonathan closed the folder, unable to look at more photos. "Why show me this now? Because if you're going to be part of her life again, you need to understand everything she overcame, everything she built without you." Ryan stood. "And because you need to know that if you hurt her again, there won't be a third chance. I'll make sure of it." The implicit threat was clear, but Jonathan found he couldn't resent it. If anything, he respected Ryan more for his fierce protectiveness of Grace. "I understand," Jonathan said simply. Ryan nodded once, then left without another word. The next morning, Grace arrived alone, explaining that Lucas had a field trip. She found Jonathan in the rehabilitation center's garden, his wheelchair positioned beside a small koi pond. "You look serious," she commented, taking a seat on the bench beside him. "Bad therapy session." "No," Jonathan said, gathering his courage. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She looked wary, but nodded. "Okay. Is there any part of you that could ever forgive me? Not just for what happened 8 years ago, but for not being there during your illness? During Lucas's early years, for all of it?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the koi circling in the pond. "I think," she said finally, "that I started forgiving you the moment I saw you in that hospital bed. Maybe even before that, when you told me about your father's manipulation." Jonathan hardly dared breathe. "And is there any chance, any possibility at all, that we could try again, not immediately, not rushing into anything, but maybe a new beginning?" Grace turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've spent 8 years rebuilding my life, Jonathan, building walls to protect myself and Lucas. I'm not sure I can risk tearing them down again." "I understand," Jonathan said, his heart sinking. "But," Grace continued softly, reaching for his hand, "I'm not sure I can bear the thought of losing you a second time either." Jonathan intertwined his fingers with hers. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm willing to try," Grace said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Slowly, carefully, with Lucas's well-being as the priority. I wouldn't want it any other way," Jonathan assured her. 3 months later, under the dappled shade of oak trees in the rehabilitation center's garden, Jonathan and Grace exchanged simple vows in an intimate ceremony. Jonathan sat in his wheelchair, his legs still healing but his heart fully restored. Grace wore a simple white cotton dress, her face radiant with a happiness she had once thought lost forever. Lucas, beaming with importance, presented them with rings on a small velvet cushion. Ryan Clark stood as a witness, his presence a testament to the healing that extended beyond just Grace and Jonathan. "I promise to trust your love, to believe in your heart, and to never again let fear dictate my choices," Jonathan vowed, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to embrace this second chance, to build a future based on truth and understanding, and to remember that even the deepest wounds can heal with time and love," Grace replied, as they sealed their vows with a kiss. Lucas cheered, and butterflies took flight from the garden flowers, spiraling upward in a dance of color against the blue sky. 5 years later, the Olivia Thompson Foundation for Children with Cancer stood on the site of Charles Walker's former mansion, a beacon of hope and healing, where once had been a monument to suspicion and control. And in the foundation's entrance hall hung a portrait of a smiling young woman whose life, though brief, had created ripples of love and connection that transformed tragedy into a story of redemption and second chances.